Lovely. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us. Obviously this is about the just transition, a really important topic that is gaining some real traction. So I'm really excited that we're going to be talking it through with some really excited panelists that you can see on the screen, which we'll introduce them in a second. Just to give you a bit of context, the just transition is one of the areas that we've added to the WGI survey for this year for the very first time. So for any of those of you who are responding companies, keep an eye out for that. Some quantitative, some qualitative questions. And obviously I'm more than happy to help with them when you come to them. Lovely. So it is the first year, that, as I said, that we're asking the questions. So sort of watch this space for March next year when we release the findings report to see what the responding companies have said in this year's responses. Lovely. So in a second, I'm going to pass to the panelists and ask them to introduce themselves and their work in this space. Then we're going to move on to a panel discussion, and we have some time for Q&A at the end. So please do send any questions that come to you as and when you want to. Don't feel you have to wait to the end. We might tackle them as they arise, but we'll probably keep them to the end, just so you don't worry if you ask a question, we don't immediately answer it. And I know a couple of people as well asked some questions in the registration form when they signed up for the webinar. So we'll make sure we ask the panelists those ones as well. So thank you, those people, for being very prepared and sending questions so far in advance. Lovely. So you can send the questions either in the chat or the Q&A function, whichever works for you. Lovely. Okay, so let's ask the panelists to introduce themselves first then. So Brendan, perhaps I could start with you and then maybe move to Mia and then to Lauren, just so that we have a flow. Lovely. Thanks, Brendan. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie, and thanks for inviting me to speak and for everyone taking a little bit of time to listen. So yeah, Brendan Curran, I'm a senior policy fellow at the London School of Economics at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, to use its very long name, sometimes shortened to GRI. I've been working there for a couple of years now, very specifically on financing a just transition, looking at both the role of both public finance policy, as well as the role of private institutions, private finance institutions, as well as corporates, and the role that they play, and the leverage points that they have in sort of driving forward a just transition. So that's what our research is focused on over the last few years, very much UK and EU focused, but other members in the team at Grantham look at emerging markets as well. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak. I'll stop introducing myself there.
I'm Mia McCarthy, and I work for SSE as their head of sustainability for Ireland, so covering off Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. I suppose for those of you who don't know who SSE is, we're a leading generator of renewable electricity, and we're one of the largest electricity networks in the UK, and we develop, own and operate our own low carbon infrastructure. So that would include offshore and onshore wind, hydropower, electricity transmission and distribution grids, and efficient gas-fired generation as well, as well as providing energy products and services to businesses. And we have a footprint in GB, Northern Ireland, and Republic of Ireland, as I've mentioned, and now we've also moved into other jurisdictions, so Japan, Denmark, Portugal, Poland, and Spain more recently. We're a FTSE 100 company. We're a living wage employer, and we're also Fair Tax Mark accredited. And I suppose for us, just transition has become more than a topic. It's become integral to that net zero transition, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But yeah, that's us. Thank you. And thanks for having us here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Peacock from Scottish Widows. I am a responsible investment manager in the stewardship team. We published a report on just transition last year, and I'm kind of increasingly doing more on the topic. And Scottish Widows is a pension provider, and we have approximately 200 billion in assets under management, and we are an asset owner. So we do some direct engagement, but also, engage our asset managers as well. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks everyone. So as you can see, a very well qualified panel to talk about this. Lovely. So I think it's probably worth setting the scene a bit more for anyone who is maybe slightly newer to this topic. So Brendan, as you've got the most academic background, perhaps we could start with you to give a bit more detail about what a just transition is in theory and in practice as well.
Yeah, sure. I always forget that I'm kind of an academic. If you look at my background, I'm a bit of a fake academic, but don't tell anyone. But yeah, I mean, it's good to go back to, this term just transition is slightly in vogue now, both in international agreements and in corporate finance, civil rights circles, and it's absolutely great that it's having that moment. But there's always a risk when this happens, as to, understanding what it really means. So starting off with, I mean, it actually has its foundations in the workers' movement. So very much was a trade union term dating back actually to sort of environmental justice events in the USA back in the 70s. But coming a little bit more to the present, it really had its a major reference through the International Labour Organization working through the UNFCCC at the Paris Agreement back in 2015. And there it got referenced and acknowledged within the Paris Agreement, which is, a major milestone in terms of progress, in terms of international agreements. And it said that the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with the nationally defined development priorities had to be part of any sort of transition to net zero globally. And so that highlighted the role of workers, but generally we think about it bringing together through the transition to net zero, thinking about how it brings together a number of different sustainable development goals as well. 12 on climate action, obviously, 10, how do you reduce inequalities? SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and 7, which is affordable and clean energy. So when we're talking about the just transition, we're almost trying to move out of, I guess, a single variable approach to decarbonization and going just beyond, not just going beyond decarbonization, but thinking about what are the sort of social ramifications of decarbonization? How can we mitigate the risks through that transition? But also maximize the social opportunities in terms of human rights, labor rights, and economic growth and development as well. So that's generally how we think about it. Oh, and of course, the third tenet of how we describe it is ensuring that there is the opportunity for social dialogue and community input, which is probably a very important aspect of just transition, but often quite a difficult one to do in practice.
Super, thank you, Brendan. That was very appropriately academic. I don't think you're a fake academic at all. That's brilliant. And Mia, I wonder if you could give us a bit more sort of an insight into what just transition planning looks like in practice for a company on the ground. That would be cool.
Sure, thanks, Rosie. Yeah, so taking it back a step, I suppose, SSE's business strategy is wholly focused on supporting the transition to net zero. And we see this as a big opportunity for us. So we have set out an investment plan of 18 billion out to 2027. And looking at our targets, I suppose, of achieving net zero for direct emissions is by 2040 and indirect by 2050. And so with all of this decarbonisation comes change. And we kind of view it as the outcome of this change. The way that we do that is as important as the outcome. And that's where just transition, I suppose, comes to the fore. Because we recognise with this energy transition, there is potential for inequalities and injustice to occur. And I suppose in order for us to stave off any of that unfairness, we set about developing our just transition strategy in 2020. So we're the first company in the world to do so. And we developed 20 principles that we kind of felt were focused on the transitioning away from high carbon industry and transitioning into low carbon industry. And those principles were, in essence, to be kind of, I suppose, a guidebook for us in terms of how we operated our business. So looking at things like, for example, some of the principles being providing forward notice of change, repurposing thermal assets for a net zero world, and redeployment and retraining for workers. So the 20 covered off, I suppose, our various stakeholders that we would have within the business. So our community, our customers, our employees, and being able to set in stone these hard principles that as we move through this net zero journey, the company has a kind of a guiding point that they can use and a reference point, I suppose, that they could use. So that's where we kind of started in terms of the practicalities of the just transition piece of work with that strategy. And then out of the strategy, we did a workers report in 2021, which I suppose identified kind of, or looked more closely at one of the core kind of stakeholder groups, that being the employees, and being able to kind of look at reasons for people transitioning out of the jobs they were in to us, and I suppose the drivers for that, maybe the reasons for staying, and being able to kind of look at that more closely to be able to kind of identify, I suppose, any patterns that were there. And then more recently, we did a progress report. So looking at those principles we'd set out in 2020, and over the last 2 years, being able to kind of look at the impact, or I suppose the outcomes of those principles and what that meant in real terms kind of across the business. So that's kind of, I suppose, how we've taken what Brendan has mentioned there, kind of in the academic kind of concept piece, and bring it more into the practice piece within the business.
Lovely, thanks, Mia. Really, really useful into sort of the practical aspects of it, as you say. Lovely. So we've heard a bit more from the corporate side with Mia there. Lauren, I wonder if you could turn to you to ask about what's happening in the investor sphere around this.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Rosie. So I think, as Brendan and Mia have pointed out, it isn't a new topic, and actually, you know, some investors have been engaging on this for a while. But I think what's probably changed is that it's become a bit more mainstream in the last couple of years. And I think for us, when we're kind of going about it, the first thing that we're doing is just making sure we integrate it whenever we talk about climate. And it's the same for, you know, biodiversity and nature as well, that whenever we talk about climate, we talk about that too. And I think that's a bit of a change over the last couple of years, and rather than just having those kind of very focused conversations just on targets and emissions, it's a much more kind of holistic conversation about the just transition and the kind of broader impacts of that. And I think that's really positive, because I think we're just kind of siloed on that, you know, one target or one metric. It's not really going to achieve what we need to achieve. So that's the first thing. And then I think, secondly, we've also seen just a focused target on just transition itself as well. So, I mean, just this year, we've seen at least 3 kind of shareholder resolutions on the just transition specifically, and there's probably many more of these than the ones that we supported and spotted. So Marathon, Exxon and Chevron all has just transition resolutions, which I think, yeah, really shows a kind of shift in the dialogue, that it's, you know, we're not just seeing climate resolutions, we're seeing specific, what are you doing about your workers in this kind of conversation. And then also, I think, again, there's both the kind of integration and the kind of ongoing conversation, and then, you know, there's the shareholder resolutions, and then there's also recently the World Benchmarking Alliance have just launched a coalition of investors, again, just targeted conversations under just transitions. A bit of a tongue twister, the more times I say it, which I think is great. So it's kind of that combination of, you know, integrating it, but then also having that targeted engagement that I think has really changed over the last year or so.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I think that sort of interaction of those 3 aspects, as you say, will be really, really punchy. Looking forward to seeing what happens with it. Absolutely. Lovely. Brendan, you of course also work a lot with investors. What are you seeing? Anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, we have been working over the last 3 years with an investor alliance. Well, actually, it's a bit wider than just investors, but it's something called the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, or FAHIDA, as we call it. We do bread-based acronyms through a lot of our alliances, but yeah, Scottish Widows is a member. That's right, I think, and as well as a number of other investors. But really, that was set up in 2020 and was really started off trying to do the case making exercise for the role that investors could play in financing a just transition. And there's been a lot of success to that. We have over 50, or we have had over 50 financial institutions, as well as place-based organizations, to try and it's a UK-focused investor alliance primarily, though obviously investors will have portfolios that go outside the UK. But really what we were trying to do there was, first of all, make the case for the role that investors could play in a just transition, and then move into some actual application. I think, as Mia called it, like how does this work in the real world, and away from the kind of academic theory. And yet we have some kind of real tangible actions. And I suppose I can give an example that pulls all of our panelists together quite well, which is we worked with Royal London Asset Management and Friends Provident Foundation to get them to use our just transition financing framework, a report we did a few years ago, something called From the Grand to the Granular, and use that to engage with energy utilities around Europe, including, of course, pioneering SSE. There were others like Enel, Enel's in Italy, right, and Taron in Poland as well. So, and there's if anyone ever wonders about the sort of impact of investor engagement, I think SSE took a lead and wanted to take that pioneering role, but other energy utilities follow suit in publishing a just transition strategy. Scottish Water, I think, or Scottish Power, and a few others as well. So we've continued this, and this is why I probably call myself a fake academic. Maybe it's a compliment as well to promoting myself a bit, in that we try to work with real economy actors as well as investors to ensure that what we are pontificating about, I guess, in academic circles is able to be applied in the real world. And hopefully we'll continue to do that. I work a lot in the UK, but other colleagues are doing similar things in emerging markets like India, where perhaps we're creating a investor alliance called the ROTI, which is the Round Table on Transition something. Sorry, I've forgotten what the I is for. But as you can see, there's bread acronyms, but a lot of good action as well.
No, I mean, if you've got something to remember the acronym by, it's always going to stick much, much better. No, that sounds really, really great, Brendan. Thank you for very aptly bringing everyone together there with your example. Lovely. So we have, of course, been experiencing a very challenging time around the world with the long-lasting effects of COVID. So it'd be good to explore that a bit more. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, and maybe we could look at it a bit more, from both angles, sort of issues and opportunities that the crisis around the pandemic has caused, as well as, of course, the difficult current inflationary economic environment, and look a bit about how those factors are helping or hindering a just transition. Brendan, I know you did have some things you wanted to say on this when we talked earlier, so please do let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, it's big topics, I guess. I mean, I'm going to start, and this is going to make me sound like an academic again, with a definition point, which is there is climate justice and then there's just transition. And climate justice is generally thinking about the distributive impacts, I guess, across the globe of climate change, and how we can sort of correct for that, potentially through capital flows and other actions, whereas a just transition is generally thinking about the social ramifications through the transition. So it can be in the global north, it can be in the global south, both definitions actually, but it's good to make that distinction. And the reason I say that is that, to answer your question a bit more widely, is that what we're interested in is the transition to net zero. We need large swathes of capital to move both from the global north to global south, but also into probably, I guess, sub-commercial programs at times. So there needs to be also not just a mix of public finance that can, doesn't need to get a commercial return, but working with private finance that does need a commercial return. I think if you look at the IEA's estimates or the IPCC's estimates on what is needed in terms of capital flows, public finance alone is not going to be sufficient. So that is the challenge. I think we often hear numbers around 1 trillion before 2030. There's, in the UK alone, we need 50 billion of additional investment every year by 2030. I think that's in the tens of billions at the minute. That was with a baseline of 2020. That's the Committee on Climate Change estimates. So that's the challenge. And I'm going to now paint a little bit of a bleak picture, and then hopefully we can move on to the opportunity, in the sense that there are real challenges in getting sufficient investment to flow from I guess, developed nations to emerging markets, where the demand is greatest for the transition generally, and also then if we wrap in the social element for a just transition. I guess the problem is, where that challenge is greatest, we don't have an existing regulation, whether in the EU or in other developed nations, isn't really incentivized to allow, let's say, an asset manager like Scottish Widows or any other asset manager in, I guess, the EU or North America to invest in emerging economies, whether that's Basel III, Solvency II. You add in further barriers from what I guess we call quite a stringent, or increasingly stringent, sustainable finance regulation that's coming from the EU, the UK, everywhere else as well. Those put further barriers to capital moving into emerging markets, because often in some, certainly in more developing countries, they don't have the reporting capability to report on carbon emissions, human rights and labour standards to the same degree as perhaps an EU country has. And so things like the EU taxonomy and others create further pinch points in terms of how someone like Lauren or Scottish Widows can invest in the just transition in emerging economies. I guess to kind of finish with a slightly more positive note. No, I've got one more bad point actually before I go to the positive. You asked about inflationary pressures. Yeah, I mean, again, with existing problems, due to kind of political risk and currency risk, that's still going to be a problem. And again, I'm still more talking about that kind of north to south investment flows, and obviously a just transition can be within a country as well, and is in the global north. With inflation, that often will further further price investment. Will make the business case a lot more difficult. And inflation around the globe has already done that in the offshore wind market in the UK just last week, I guess. I mean, there are other factors at play, but primarily it's inflation of costs around the globe for the offshore wind. So it's difficult. But just to end on a slightly more positive point, because I feel like I was slightly doom harboring there for quite a while. I think there are existing efforts, obviously, to scale up blended finance that kind of answer some of these challenges, both within the role within public finance or development finance institutions within countries like the UK Infrastructure Bank here in the UK, the EIB in Europe's been doing that for a long time, and as well as there are new kind of innovative mechanisms to invest in the just transition. So those on the call might be aware of the Just Energy Transformation Partnerships in South Africa, Indonesia, now Senegal, Vietnam, which are good initiatives if done right. So what we're seeing is there's a large, and for those that keep up with the G20 this week, there was a lot of debate around the role that IFIs and MDBs can play in terms of their reform to get more capital flowing into the transition in a way that's cost effective as well. So there is, on a positive note, a lot of work going to respond to these kind of investment headwinds, I guess, for want of a better term. But it is challenging, both from a global north to global south perspective, and as we saw in the UK this week, even in developed markets, we need to get the investment conditions right. So sorry, I hope that wasn't too negative the whole time.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Brendan. And no doubt that, yeah, big amounts of money are needed, and we need to step that up. Lovely. And anyway, I asked you for the issues. So if you were doom, it was my fault. Lovely. So lovely. So we can look now a bit more at other broader factors and why there has been shift in focus towards the S of the ESG. Why that's important. Obviously, from the WI perspective, that's something we're very, very interested in and very invested in. Mia, I know when we were speaking about this earlier, you had some really interesting points about future planning, etc. So I wonder if we could go into that a bit more now.
Sure, yeah. I suppose in terms of kind of why the S is a focus, if we look at kind of through the lens that we look at in SSE with those various stakeholder groups that I mentioned earlier, so if we look at kind of the customer, for example, we recognize again with this transition, we need to ensure that it's kind of equitable for everybody. So when we talk about kind of the affordability of energy, who has access to that energy, when we look at kind of new technologies, who can actually use them, we kind of for example, in Ireland, there's certain targets set around the kind of transitioning out of diesel cars and EVs being, brought in at some point. But again, the affordability of all of those things, and then also the networks that would be there to support them. So recognizing that in this kind of really rapidly pace that we're moving, we need to make sure that everybody is brought with us, that nobody is left behind, and that everybody has equal access to all the services that are there. So I suppose from the customer point of view, that's kind of the S, the focus on that. Then the S has been more kind of highlighted in terms of the worker piece as well. So the employee kind of stakeholder part of all of this. And I suppose traditionally that was always the area that was kind of considered the most within the just transition, and maybe not so much the consumer or the customer and other elements as well. But in saying that, kind of now, businesses are looking at these huge plans that they've kind of set themselves in terms of that kind of net zero goal, the amount of the scale that's needed and required in terms of kind of the development of assets, who's going to man them. Businesses kind of constantly growing. So our business is no different to any other in terms of the amount of people that are needed over X amount of time. Where is it that they're going to come from? Where are they transitioning out of? So from a business point of view and from kind of a HR function point of view, it's really being able to kind of look at where are those sunset industries, the industries that are kind of in decline, and where are the sunrise industries where there's kind of more burgeoning activity going on. So it's become a focus in that way, and as well in terms of kind of, well, how are we going to attract this workforce, and also recognizing that the workplaces that were before that we're shifting away from and moving to the kind of new workforces of the future in this low carbon area. There's kind of two sides to it, because traditionally when people worked in certain industries, they may have worked for 40 odd years, their whole lifetime went in when they were a young person, and kind of left at the, not the end of their life, but later on in life, and would have kind of created these communities. And a lot of people, when you would speak to them, we recently kind of spoke to ex-employees in one of our plants that closed, Fiddler's Ferry in the north of England, and they would speak so fondly about the camaraderie that they had, and often their colleagues were more like family than their family, because the kind of the length of shifts that you would do and the type of work that you would do, there was a real kind of a sense of brotherhood. And I say brotherhood because I suppose on the flip side of that, we had very kind of homogenous workforces, primarily men, primarily in some cases white. And so we want to very much respect the history of what people had, because you don't want to in any way devalue, what somebody has kind of given their life for, but also recognize that there were some things that, when we have now this opportunity to create these new workforces for the future, we have an opportunity to kind of do them in the best possible way. So, having a good diverse mix of people within a workforce, also kind of looking, I suppose, at kind of in terms of kind of the flexibility of work and, the way people are working now. So with all of that, the S has come very much to the fore, because employees and lack of employees and gaps in numbers of employees is kind of critical to businesses in order for them to do what we need to do to get to the point where we need to get to. And as I say, that kind of the heritage piece, the legacy piece, and unusually in SSE, we actually have a heritage division or unit where they're very much kind of, their task is to ensure that the legacy of what went before is kind of very much kind of kept, curated, and it's there for time immemorial for people to be able to see kind of all these steps that we've gone through to get to kind of the types of operations and the way we operate today, where that has come from and where we'd like to see it go into the future.
Lovely, thanks, Mia. Yeah, I can absolutely appreciate if those people have worked together for that long. It's important, that community is very, very important to them. Absolutely. Lauren, if I could just move to you quickly, I know you feel quite strongly about the S being well represented, so we could hear your thoughts. That'd be super.
Yeah, I really do, and it's so lovely to hear, Mia, your experience at SEC. It's thinking about the past is really, I think, special as well. But yeah, anyway, it is really important, and I think it's part of a kind of broadening and redefining of ESG a little bit, I think, that's going on, because I think, we've always had the kind of human capital management engagement that investors have done, and, companies are thinking about their workforce, but I think increasingly, and Mia kind of touched on this a little bit, it's not just about the workforce, it's actually about society and community, and that the impact of a company on those things. So, I think increasingly in our conversations with companies, it's not just about the human capital management, it's about diversity, poverty, inequality, because, we're asset owners, we're universal owners, we own, the whole index. And like Brendan said, sadly, not much emerging markets, but, certainly kind of in the developed world, we own everything. And therefore, when we're thinking about the kind of risks and opportunities, yes, it's unfortunate if one company doesn't manage their workforce well, but actually it's really bad if the kind of systemic social issues come to the front and we see, social unrest, conflict, mass migration, all these things actually are going to completely destroy our portfolio, not just kind of lose a sector. So, I think S is increasingly important and increasingly important at that kind of systemic level, and that's kind of what we're trying to engage on a lot as well.
Lovely, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, couldn't agree more. S is absolutely crucial to everything. Brendan, you obviously know a lot about how about the interplay of all the different aspects of ESG and beyond. So I wonder if you wanted to add anything to what Mia and Lauren have said.
Yeah, just to echo a little bit of some of the points and maybe bring it out to a kind of policy perspective, I guess, which is I think I use the term efficiency of the net zero transition will be determined by how there is an interplay between the social as well as the degradation of nature and biodiversity and the conservation of it as well, and how these things, they're not independent, there are interdependencies. And so if you take again a sort of siloed approach, which in some ways just by listing out ESG, it can tend itself to that, or thinking a policy making can tend to, take a slightly siloed approach. Then you risk, unintended consequences. We've seen some policy impacts of that, where climate policy has been implemented without due consideration of the sort of socioeconomic impacts. The Gilets Jaunes movement in France sort of had it was sparked really by a fuel tax. There's a famous quote by one of the protesters who said, you're thinking about the end of the world, and a lot of us are thinking about the end of the month or the week. So, trying to get that balance right between social buy-in to the net zero transition through policy, as well as corporate or private institution action, is going to be crucial. Otherwise, there will be a breakdown of the social contract. I mean, we've seen some examples of that in the UK with the ULEZ pushback. I hesitate to use that example. I think it's hard to discern social unrest, deep social unrest, from what is amplified in the media. But it will be a concern, and I think Mia's examples of targets on cars. How do you make sure that secondary EV car markets are created so that there's affordable options for those less well off? It's the same tensions are there in the retrofitting of homes. Generally able to pay sections of the market are those who can afford it right now. Same with EVs and others. So if policy making isn't integrated in that approach, it's going to be even more hard for private institutions to be integrated in their thinking. So I think there's a slight, not the death of ESG, but we have to be looking at much more integrated sustainability more generally, bringing that nature, social and climate considerations together.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We're seeing real life effects of it right now, and it's just going to get more accentuated. Absolutely. Super. Okay, so let's try and be quite practical now. How would you like to see companies adapting to providing a just transition? What tools do they have? What challenges have companies experienced? So Mia, I'll probably go to you first, if that's okay, as the company perspective, to talk a bit about that.
Sure. I think in terms of what companies can do, I think the whole piece around co-creation is so important. You can't do, like with anything, you can't do kind of in silo. In terms of our strategy that we developed and the subsequent reports that we did afterwards, they were always very much kind of in collaboration or in discussion with the key groups that we needed to be brought into the fold. So, for example, having conversations with unions, as Brendan had mentioned earlier, kind of the whole just transition movement kind of started through the workers' movement in the very beginning. So it would be remiss for us as a company not to have their kind of their ideas and kind of their contributions taken on board. Also in terms of, I suppose, again, kind of looking at other groups that are kind of the representation of the kind of wider society as well. So in terms of kind of being engaging with, we've mentioned earlier as well, Brendan, around the kind of the nature piece, but kind of in terms of, say, organizations, environmental organizations. So all of the stakeholders that you think are key to the work that you're looking at, the work that you're doing, somebody who can kind of advocate on behalf of the consumer. Because in order to build kind of a robust, whether it's a strategy you're going for as a company or whether it's a piece of work you're wanting to do, in order for you to build a really robust kind of piece that incorporates all of the point of views, you can't do that without sitting down and speaking to people. And it's not that everything may be taken on board, because depending on, I suppose, what you're trying to do as a company, some things will fit and other things may not, but at least you're starting from the point of having all of those opinions and comments, in consideration. So I think that's really key, and we would like to look at doing more of that as well, kind of as we move through. Even I'd mentioned earlier around our progress report that we launched in April, which was very much a kind of an overview of our principles. And we had said at the time we would kind of do an open and transparent, report. So if there was some of the principles where we hadn't taken much action, or the action hadn't necessarily, I suppose, resulted in something that was a hugely positive impact, we would also kind of report on that, because the whole idea is to be as transparent as possible. But in the launching of that, again, and in the writing of that reporting, again, we engaged with the unions and kind of said, this is what we set out, this is what we're looking to do. What else do you think we should consider in that? We also spoke to some of the asset managers as well, and investors, so all of those key stakeholders to ensure that kind of what we were putting out was what they also wanted to see, because they felt then the kind of the detail was really being interrogated. So I think that's a clear, especially I suppose depending on who's on the webinar today and who's listening, if you're at the very kind of the infancy of your journey, and maybe kind of you're just hearing the conversations around just transition, I would say in order for you to kind of gain a better understanding, kind of maybe take yourselves outside of your company and kind of see what's happening in the external world, and also speak to those who maybe you wouldn't necessarily speak to. And that'll kind of help inform maybe what it is you need to do as a company, and being able to identify those stakeholders as well from the outset, because again, you can kind of frame all of the work that you do from that point on, very much through the lens of them. So I think, and in terms of kind of the challenges piece, I suppose we're in a position at the moment, again, in our progress report, and I'd mentioned one or two of the kind of the principles earlier, where we kind of said, say, forward notice of closure, if there was to be any of our assets, for example, that we're going to be closing, to be very clear on kind of the notice that we would give and the process and procedures that we would go through. I suppose you would say you may have that as standard anyway, but at the moment, into the future, there isn't anything that's kind of, will be closing. But again, it's, I suppose, having those pieces in place that we can kind of refer back to, so we can kind of almost go through it stage by stage and process by process, and be able to say, well, are we considering X, Y, and Z in all of this? And also, I suppose, depending on the size of the company too, if somebody is kind of working in a certain division somewhere else, they're not always as close to maybe what we see kind of from the sustainability aspect. So again, it's being able to kind of use those as reference points, because they can be things that will be challenges within a company. So I think if you have something, again, that you can kind of very much refer back to, that the work has already been put into from the beginning, it just makes things that little bit easier in terms of the communication between the workforce and the outcomes of what will happen if you're looking at, say, a closure situation. And even in terms of kind of what are your very clear aims around redeployment and retraining, like what have you set, kind of have you set specific targets? And it's also, I suppose, for a lot of people, with the caveat of where we can do these things, because sometimes, it may not be within your gift. If you have an asset and you're looking to repurpose it, again, depending on maybe the planning limitations, some of the outside variables, it'll just mean that there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. But again, if you have almost your Bible that you can kind of refer back to and say, okay, this is what we would like to do in best case, and kind of use that as your starting point. But I think the key piece I would say is in terms of the co-creation piece, and kind of definitely that good work to be able to do that together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mia. I think, I suppose like many things in life, we need to be open to speaking to other people and actually listening to them and taking on board that feedback to make sure everyone's voices are considered. You're absolutely right. Lauren, I know we have touched on policymakers and Brendan especially, but I know you wanted to mention something about that here as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for the first point of view, it's, really keen for companies to publish reports, publish plans, exactly what SSC are doing, basically. But I think in addition to that, there's two things. I think one of the challenges for us as investors is actually just transition plans alone aren't that strong in all cases, and therefore it's hard to have a conversation about a just transition if a company isn't even acknowledging that they need to transition. So that's kind of always a step one, isn't it? But then I think in addition to that, when companies are a bit more established and are thinking about this a bit more seriously, it'd be great to see a bit more of that kind of vocalness about what government's role could be. I mean, listening to me, I think, I'm sure there's lots of things that companies can do, but then it's kind of saying to government, well, we can do all this, but if you provided this, then actually this would be 100 times more positive, or we could really provide those workers with not only some retraining from us, but also safety net from you, and incentives for kind of new industry to come in. Or it's all this kind of big holistic picture, isn't it, which I think we struggle with for kind of various reasons. So yeah, I think in an ideal world it'd be nice to see it just a bit more of that kind of vocal, if we really want this to work, this is what we need, because I think we're all a little bit scared of being political, I think, sometimes. And but in the kind of current scenario and what we need to achieve, we need to be a bit braver. Investors too, we all do.
No, absolutely. Good call to action, Lauren. I think you're absolutely right. And it's a very important piece of the puzzle, obviously, policymakers and the vocalness around it. Lovely. Okay, super. So just to end on as proactive a note as possible, if I could just ask each of you for one action that you recommend people take to help progress a just transition. Mia, you've already spoken a bit about looking externally in the previous question, so maybe I could come to you and you could give your one action.
My one action, check out our website, sse.com, and there's a Just Transition page where you'll find the strategy that we've mentioned, and also there is a short documentary that we did. I've mentioned our plant in Fiddler's Ferry in the north of England that is closed, and you'll hear kind of some of the voices, I suppose, of the people that work there, as well as others, the union members, the environmental groups, within that documentary. And it just, for people maybe who are newer to this concept, it'll give a good kind of overview of the topic, with not just SSE's opinion, but a wider opinion as well. So I think in terms of that, being able to just maybe have a look at those few things from our side. And if anybody who's on the webinar had any kind of particular queries or questions, or wanted kind of some steer in some way, I'd say feel free to get in touch. So that would be my call to action.
Thank you, Mia. That sounds fab and nicely positive. Maybe we could do Brendan and then Lauren, last but by no means least.
Yeah, sure. And I've seen that documentary. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Makes the just transition seem Hollywood. So that's a good start. So yeah, I mean, I might echo a little bit. I didn't know. Mia cheated and said that, referred to the website. So I'm going to do that firstly too. We've got a lot of research published on the Grantham Research Institute website. So have a look at that. And a lot of it's tailored towards guiding institutions as well as policymakers on how to deal with this. So, and do follow up if you have any questions. And my sort of one thing, if you had to do one thing, is just try to move out of that siloed thinking. Again, whether you're a policymaker, an institution, or a financier, single variable action is not going to solve the long-term problems and may actually exacerbate them. So thinking about, if you're going to do decarbonization or climate transition plan, how do you make it just? How do you make sure nature's in there as an enabling factor as well, and not be creating further biodiversity degradation? So trying to think about sustainability in an integrated way and not just looking at one small part of it. So I want to get rid of ESG for different reasons than some other people, but maybe for that.
And yeah, my point was kind of similar in terms of, just ensuring that integration happens. I think, because we are in a climate emergency, there can feel like there's so much to say on climate, so much to get across when you're engaging companies or governments, whatever. And just, ensuring that just transition is always there, even though it might make your email a little bit longer. It's just so central, as Brendan's pointed out. So.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. That's all very nicely proactive. Thank you. Lovely. Okay, so let's move on to some Q&A now. And I just warn you that if you have anything specifically you want to ask Lauren about, she will need to leave a few minutes early for another very important meeting. So do get your questions in early for her. And as I said, send them through chat or the Q&A. But we have had a few come through. I'll do the ones that came through the registration form first. So the first one was, are there any standards for ensuring just transition is embedded within a company strategy, and how do they provide an assessment of progress should reducing emissions take priority over ensuring the transition is inclusive and fair? So there's quite a lot in there, and quite a few questions actually. Does anyone particularly want to tackle that first?
I would just say I think it'll become more asked about, even in terms of, Rosie, you'd said within your survey this year, you have the questions which are on my to-do list to fill them in, and I will do. But I think we'll see a lot more of that. There will be more questioning in various investor surveys that we receive, and across even the various, I suppose, kind of regulatory pieces that we have to comply with now. So I think, although it may not be now, it will be coming, like a lot of things, it will be coming down the track. So I think for companies, if you're kind of even to start with your own kind of way of being able to embed things and being able to track things, it'll set you up for later on down the tracks when you're required to. The latter part of that question, in terms of should the emissions reduction piece kind of take precedence over the kind of social side of things, I think was my understanding. I would say, from a personal perspective, that the two need to go in tandem. I think, you can't have one without the other. They go very much in tandem. And I know for a lot of companies, again, it's a kind of a piece around resourcing, again, depending on their size and scale, where they feel that they can kind of only tackle one issue at a time. But I think, again, when we speak about this transition, just transition, it is across the spectrum in terms of kind of, again, that stakeholder piece, where it's the consumers, it's the employees, it's the communities. It needs to consider all of that. And if we ignore or don't kind of focus on one aspect of it, it is to our detriment at the end of the day, because that inequality and that unfairness, the whole purpose of a just transition is to be able to kind of to get rid of that side of things. So I think where you can, and whoever's asking that question, I think if you can do, you should look at the two kind of on par and tackle both together.
Can I just add an additional point onto that? And I'm going to shamelessly reference some of our work as well, which is we've been doing a lot over the last year around transition plans. So taking it through some corporate net zero transition plans, and taking it through a UK lens, but transition plans are becoming very much international through the voluntary Glasgow Financial Alliance Net Zero, GFANZ, which has a transition plan framework which is aligned with what the EU EFRAG are recommending, as well as what the UK Transition Plan Task Force are recommending. So sorry for all the regulatory references, but just to say that it is quite aligned. And we did a piece of research / guidance that we did in coordination with investors, banks, and real economy actors to, first of all, think about how you can make transition plans just. That was the kind of the name of the research. So I think there's some good guidance in there. Furthermore, we have been co-chairing a working group as part of the Transition Plan Task Force on just transition, so helping to ensure that advice from that TPT, which the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator in the UK, is involved in, ensures that it is not just a climate transition plan, but how do you think about the social aspects? How do you think about the there are other working groups on adaptation and nature as well. So there will be more advice coming out on that in terms of a sector neutral guidance framework for transition plans. Don't hold me to dates, so I'm going to say soon. That sector neutral framework's come out. They put out an initial one. I think there's been further advice, and there's going to be another one. There will also be sector specific guidance across a number of different sectors, including energy utilities, different financial subsectors, as well as, you know, each of those working groups, nature, adaptation, and just transition, will be having outputs as well. So what I'm saying is there's going to be lots more hopefully useful advice in terms of disclosing transition plans coming from the UK, and I know that the European Union has also is also going that way, or if not more advanced. Sometimes I get very confused. There's so many different parts of the EU sustainable finance regulation, so I'm not going to start saying all the acronyms for that, but I'd say look in that space as well.
Lovely, thank you both. That's super helpful, and really nicely practical. And actually, the second question we had through the registration form was quite similar. It's what's best practice for KPI setting. So I think you've both delved into that quite nicely. Lovely. So a couple of other things that have come through. One was, Brendan, for you. What can we? What it says? How can the approach in the emerging markets differ to in the UK? If you have anything you want to add on that, that would be great.
It's different because, you know, emerging market, it's a big place, but I'll try and give some general thoughts. I guess one thing, you see, a lot of the just transition best practice that we've seen so far has been in the global north or industrialized nations, and so where you have kind of embedded fossil fuel infrastructure, which means that there is almost more transaction costs to, you know, winding down coal, and greater environmental costs, but also greater social costs, right? As a lot of industries and communities rely on that. Now, that doesn't hold forever. I mean, if you look at Indonesia, South Africa, you know, these are economies heavily reliant on coal. Same with Vietnam. And how do you in a social way roll those down and diversify those economies is an extremely costly and difficult thing to do. And obviously they don't have the as developed financial markets or capital markets as perhaps the UK has or America has. And so there is a reliance there on industrialized nations playing a greater role in supporting those. So the JETPs is one example that's trying to do that. You know, as I said, some of the international financial regulation probably does need to adjust to allow that to happen. Like even something like anti-money laundering legislation actually prevents a lot of capital flowing into emerging markets. So there, you know, this is what the G20 was talking about in India just the last couple of days. So it's a challenge, but it's one that everyone's rising to. I guess one thing I'd say, just on a kind of positive note, is that depending on the country, there are examples in the emerging markets and developing nations where, ironically, through a lack of infrastructure development, where there's good financing mechanisms put in place. I'm sorry, Lauren, I'm talking when you're about to leave it, but you know, there is almost an opportunity to jump forward in terms of economic development to the slightly cheaper green technologies and energy sources that we see now. I mean, there are some examples of that. Kenya is a really strong example with large geothermal capability, and even to a lesser extent Morocco, where solar capability is increased. These North African countries could become providers of energy for, you know, more developed nations in Western and Northern Europe. And that is happening already. Like Octopus are looking at putting cables underwater from Morocco, and it could be the same for Spain. So there's some promising aspects as well from an emerging market development market context. But we haven't even spoken about the sort of trade implications of the Inflation Reduction Act in America. But we don't have time. So just look into that as well.
Thank you, Brendan. That, yeah, really helpful and informative. And we're very lucky Lauren can stay for the whole session now. So that's great. Thank you, Lauren. I'll just very quickly address the question that's come through the Q&A, because it will just take me a second, which for anyone that can't see it, is will future WGI submissions be broadening out questions to cover the broader social impact, not just human capital? So the survey is now stable for 3 years, but at that stage, so early 2026, we will go through our usual very in-depth review process. And if from that we're given the steer to do that, to broaden things out, then we will. We're very much steered by the investor signatory group, the companies, trade union, policymakers, academics that feed in. So watch this space in 3 years' time, and we'll have an update for you. Lovely. So back to just in the last few minutes, very quickly, which I think is a really important question: that what role technology can play in a just transition, and whether that's a threat or an opportunity. If anyone has thoughts on that, they want to share.
Just as a very kind of, it wouldn't be my sphere of expertise, but I think, again, when I spoke earlier around the consumer piece, it's that technology bit, you know, when we were getting smart meters in our homes and everything is being kind of digitized. Again, it's ensuring that with all of this technology, which is all wonderful and brilliant, we just keep in mind everybody that needs to be kept in mind, so that when we create these kind of new ways of doing things, that there's also, in terms of, even for, you know, for example, to give a very simple example, for an older person, you know, within a house now, you've this technology that's there around your smart metering and being able to kind of, you know, see what levels of energy you're using and all the rest of it. But if there's nobody there to kind of explain the process to you, this piece of technology becomes worthless. The person can't use it, and in some cases, maybe it ends up being that their bill may be higher because it's not being used correctly. So just from that side of things, and obviously technology, just transition, massive, you know, topic. But if we kind of bring it down to that very small kind of scale and think about it from that as the starting point. So when we're doing something, is this going to be inclusive, you know, for wider society? Who is going to be brought along? Who needs to be considered in what it is we're doing? But it can offer amazing opportunities and kind of the efficiency and even the access to. So all of those things are excellent. It's just, as our starting point, again, who is the stakeholder? What is the impact on both sides? You know, is there a negative? Is there positive impact? If there's negative, how do we mitigate against them? So I think just coming from that point of view, that's what I'd say on that.
No, thanks, Mary. I think you're absolutely right. It's the infrastructure around the technology that's really important, isn't it? Absolutely. Lovely. I think we've done all the questions then, which is brilliant. So everyone can have about a minute back of their day. Thank you so much to Lauren and Brendan and Mia for joining us, and everyone in the audience as well. We'll put a recording up on the on Share Action YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it or share it with colleagues. And actually, our next webinar is on automation. So if anyone wants to, that was a very nice segue. It's on the 3rd of October. If anyone wants to join that, we'll be exploring automation with a equally interesting panel. So thank you very, very much, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, Brendan,
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thanks. Bye.